All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those who haven't joined us before, we're all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. We're really excited too this month because all October long, we are featuring amazing scientists that are working on coral reefs, one of the most important and under threat habitats on the entire planet. Right now, we've got 6 classes joining us from across North America, so I'm going to give them a chance to do a bit of a shout out. We've got Miss Bradbury's grade 7s in Halifax, Nova Scotia, who are coming in. They're invisible right now, but they will be there. We've got Miss Forsyth's grade 9s in Bracebridge, Ontario. Hi, guys.
Hi. Hey.
Hey. We've got Miss Stone's grade 1s in Cincinnati, Ohio. Hi, guys.
Hi.
We've got Miss Robertson, grade 3s in Toronto, Ontario. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Nice patriotic shirts, I love it. We've got Miss Morrison's grade 4s in Spring Arbor in Michigan. Hi, guys. Awesome. And we have got Miss Dominski's grade 6s in Niagara Falls, Ontario. Hi, guys. Of course, the reason you guys are all here today is for our speaker. So we are joined live in Washington, D.C. by Dr. Dominic Andradi-Brown, who is in the World Wildlife Fund Oceans team. He's a marine scientist for them. He also works for the Global Mangrove Alliance. So he has worked with groups all over the world and scientists all over the world in protecting coastal habitats and protecting coral reefs and making sure our oceans are good for generations to come. Without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, and take it away, Dominic.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say thanks so much for joining. I want to wave and say hi as well. I feel like I missed out on that. Hi, everyone. You wave back at me? So I'm just going to switch over to share my screen with you. So hopefully you can all see this.
Yep.
Oh, hang on just a second. Take
your time, no hurry.
There we go. There we go. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah.
Yep.
Perfect. So, hi everyone. As Jesse said, I'm Dominic Andradi-Brown. I'm a marine scientist at WWF, and I am going to talk to you a little bit for about 20 minutes about conservation in the twilight zone. And I'll explain what I mean by the twilight zone in just a minute. So I just need to say thanks to everyone who's helped me with this project, especially University of Oxford, Operation Wallacea, and WWF. And I need to thank some people who've contributed photos, which I'm going to use in this talk. So to begin with, what is a coral reef? I'm sure many of you have heard of coral reefs, but I just want to kind of reflect a little bit on what they are. So you find coral reefs in tropical waters in the oceans, in warm places, and they have lots and lots of cool animals and plants living together. So you can see here, I don't know, can you see my mouse if I move my mouse or not?
Yes, we can. Yep.
You can see my mouse, perfect. So you can see here there's lots of corals here, and so these things here are corals. So you have corals, you have lots of fish, you have some sea fans, you have plants here. So these are algae growing in amongst on the reef. And I guess a common kind of question that people have is, what is a coral? So I just want to ask you, if you know what a coral is, how many of you think a coral is a plant? If you think your coral's a plant, can you raise your hand?
Yep.
And if you think a coral is an animal, can you raise your hand? Oh, very, very mixed opinions there. So actually, corals are animals. They're very, very cool animals. And they have plants that live within them, but the coral itself is an animal. And so you wouldn't think that because it's kind of living on the bottom, it's very still, but it's actually an animal. And so on coral reefs, you have lots and lots of cool species. So you can see down here, these are some Christmas tree worms on the bottom left. So these are actually worms that look like a Christmas tree that live in the coral and pop out and take in food from the water around them. Lots of cool fish, lots of cool sea fans on the reef. So in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the projects I've been working on over the last few years on coral reefs, and particularly deeper reefs. And I'm going to kind of try and talk a little bit through the projects in order, so you can kind of get a little bit of a flavour of how I've kind of got to where I am and some of the things I've done along the way. So I guess this is a good place to start for me. So when I was a student at university, I was at a university in London. So I'm from the UK originally. And so I was in London at university, and I was really interested in marine biology and marine conservation. And I got a job working on a small tropical island in Indonesia. It was just a summer job, just for a couple of months, helping with some science work that one of the scientists at the university I was studying at was involved in. And so I was there helping do some surveys on the reef. And one of the key things we want to do when we do scientific work on coral reefs is we want to count things. And so often we want to count, say, how many fish there are on the reef, or how many corals there are on that reef. And so you're probably wondering, what am I doing here with this big camera system? So my boss had just got this new camera system, which was really cool because it let us not only count how many fish or how many corals we could see, but also how big they are. So one thing that we really want to do in science is not just count things, but know how big they are when we're working on the reef. And it's kind of like, I'm sure many of you have seen 3D movies, have been to the cinema and had to put on 3D glasses and seen those movies. And it's kind of like that. So by using two cameras, we can get images that let us, and videos that let us actually measure and see how big fish are. So up here is a parrotfish that I was measuring to see how big it was. And down here is a black coral, which I was measuring. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of these in a while in the talk. So I was out there in Indonesia as a student, as just an undergrad student, 1 year into my undergrad degree, doing this summer job, using this camera system to start collecting some data on coral reefs. And I was chatting to some friends, thinking about what can we do with this camera system that we've never been able to do before? What new things can we do? And one of the ideas that we came up with is to start looking at deep reefs. And the reason I was interested in starting to look at slightly deeper coral reefs, so the photos I've shown you so far are from coral reefs in kind of the shallows, so places you could probably just swim on the surface and have a look at. But one of the challenges with diving is that the deeper you go, the shorter amount of time you can spend there. So when you're in the shallows, you can spend a long time collecting data, and so you can swim along and you can count all the fish, you can count the corals, you can look at what everything is. But if you want to go onto deeper coral reefs, it's very hard to get good data because you don't have very long to spend down there. So I was really excited by the idea that because we have this camera system that let us collect data very, very quickly, we could go to some of these deeper reefs and get data very easily from the deep reefs. So I was excited through my undergrad degree, as I was studying at university, about this and did a little bit more work. And then I came back to the UK, and I applied for a PhD program. And so a PhD it's another type of studying you do at university, where you spend maybe around 4 or 5 years working on, you pick a topic that's really interesting to you, and you get to spend 4 or 5 years working on it and studying it and really getting to know that area well. And so I picked studying deep coral reefs. And so first I had to learn how to dive to these deep reefs, because it required some very special training. So here's a photo of me learning with a friend of mine, Grace, who also uses rebreathers. So we spent several months learning and doing a lot of specialist training to work on these deep reefs. And after several months of training, we were able to start exploring the twilight zone. So when I say deep reefs, like I've talked about the twilight zone and deep reefs, and that this talk's going to kind of focus on that. And what I'm talking about are coral reefs found from about 30 meters down to 150 meters. So that's about 100 feet down to 500 feet. So we're talking much deeper than typical reefs that most people think of. Most people think of coral reefs up in the shallows, in the bright sunlight. But these reefs, they still need sunlight, but they're just a little bit deeper. So here's an image from Honduras of one of these deep reefs. And what you can see is that there's many of the similar sort of species you see on the shallow reefs, but everything becomes a lot flatter because sunlight is really important down here. So all the corals, all the algae, they want to try and get as much sunlight as possible. So you have these really big flat corals that you see. So corals, remember from the start, corals are an animal, but they have plants that live within them. And so they still need light. So that's why they become very big and flat. So here's another image, just so you can see what some of these deep reefs look like. So there's some sponges here. These are all sponges, lots of different shapes and types of sponges. You have these big barrels, you have these rope-like long sponges, and then some algae down here as well. And we also have lots of fish as well on these reefs. So does anyone know what this fish is on the left here? Can you raise your hand if you recognize that fish?
I can go to one of the classes and see if they know, if you'd like.
Yeah, if anyone wants to have a quick shout.
Let's go to Miss Morrison's class. If you guys want to mute yourselves, if anyone thinks they know. Anyone know? Kind of fish?
Lionfish.
Lionfish, yes, that's great. Yay! Good work. I'll give you a virtual high five. Yeah, so that's a lionfish. And I'll talk a little bit more about lionfish in just a few minutes. So there's lots of very special fish we find down on these deep reefs. So I started this work and I was using some very cool diving gear to take the camera system down and do surveys on these deep reefs. So we were recording what fish and what corals we saw and measuring how big they were, because that gives us lots of really useful information on their biology. And so for the rest of this talk, there's 3 very short projects I just want to talk a little bit about. And all of these are different ways I've been using these cameras and diving to look at what condition these coral reefs are in. So looking at kind of how humans have impacted them or fishing has impacted them. And the three projects I'm going to talk about are some work on lionfish I've been doing, some work on black corals, and then also finally some work on marine protection in Indonesia, which is the main focus of my work here at World Wildlife Fund. So here we go. This is a lionfish. I know some of you know what these are. So these are what's called an invasive species. So originally they were found in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, but in the 1980s they were introduced into the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean, and we think they were introduced in Florida. So we think people kept them in their aquariums and they released them out into the ocean. And so they're really beautiful fish, and they're stunning to look at. Look at how pretty this is, with these spines and the beautiful fins and the stripes. And people often ask, why are they called lionfish? They're stripy. Surely they should be tigerfish, right? Because tigers are stripy and aren't stripy. But actually, the reason they're called lionfish is if you look at them from the front, you see these big fins that radiate out. It looks like you're looking at a lion's head with the mane around its head. So that's why they're called lionfish, not tigerfish. And they have these spines on their back, and these are quite dangerous actually. So they have what's called venom in them. So they're very, very sharp. You can see some of the points on the tops of these here. So if you stabbed yourself with one of these, or you tried to pick it up, the venom would go into your hand and it would be very, very painful. It wouldn't kill you, but it would be very, very uncomfortable. So they're, as I said, they're invasive species that were introduced into the Atlantic Ocean, and they cause a lot of damage to the coral reefs in the Caribbean. So they eat many of the fish that are there, and they disrupt the ecosystem in a big way. So by eating the fish that are there, it causes changes to the reefs. So lots of conservation groups are working to remove them from shallow reefs, and there's lots of projects going on. And the work I was doing was in association with the Bay Islands Conservation Association in Honduras and Operation Wallacea. And so I was working with this fantastic team of people out in Honduras, and we were looking at lionfish and trying to understand their dynamics on the deep reefs. So most of the conservation work, not just in Honduras, but across the whole Caribbean on lionfish, has been focused on the shallows where normal divers can reach them and snorkelers can reach them. But we started surveying deep reefs, and so this is at 55 meters or 180 feet in Honduras, and here there's 7 or 8 lionfish on the reef. And so we were diving on these shallow reefs and seeing no lionfish, because the conservation strategies, the management that was being done was really good to control the lionfish. The divers were going out and taking lionfish off the reef and collecting them. But as soon as we went to these deeper reefs, we're seeing lots and lots of lionfish there. So we were really interested in the biology and the ecology of what was going on these deep reefs. And so we started measuring them with the camera system and then also collecting some of them. So this is a friend of mine, Jack Laverick, who's using a spear here. And we were swimming along and using the spear to actually catch lionfish. Now, you remember I said they had those really sharp venomous spines on their back? So we had to, once we speared them, we had to put them into this plastic tube to carry them around, because if we held them, we were at risk of spearing ourselves on the spines. So we were collecting them from the deep reefs and bringing them up to the surface. And on the surface, we're able to study their biology. So we were cutting them up, opening up their stomachs and looking at what they'd been eating. We were looking at how much fat they had on them, because if we look at the amount of body fat on them, we can get a good idea of how healthy they are and their condition. So it was lots of really cool but slightly gruesome science we were doing, bringing up these fish and cutting them open to look at them. And so we realized that there were a lot of these lionfish on these deep reefs, and they were having quite a big impact. So some of our work has led to changes in the way some of the lionfish management work takes place. So we're now, a lot of the removals for lionfish that were being done by conservation groups, there's now much more of an effort to go to these deeper reefs and try and target some of these deeper reefs to get lionfish out from there. So this is kind of looking at how humans can, and conservation can, how they address problems on these deeper reefs. So I'm gonna shift focus a little bit and talk about a slightly different project now, also about deep coral reefs. So this is something I did about a year after that lionfish work, and so this is a very special type of coral. So you can see this very fine coral here with lots of frilly bits of it. So this is called a black coral, and they're very different to the corals that we normally think about. So these corals don't need really bright light. They actually prefer to be in places that have slightly lower levels of light. And so they're a really important species in the twilight zone on these deep reefs. You can see lots of little fish associated with them. There's lots of other invertebrates that also associate with them. And they can be really, really threatened as well by people, which is unfortunate. So for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, people have been collecting black corals to make jewelry from them. So if you cut them and polish them, they can make very pretty necklaces and earrings. And so people for many years have been collecting them to make jewelry. And one of the problems with this is they're very, very slow growing. And so it can take decades, if not hundreds of years, for black corals to recover from being harvested and being collected to make jewelry. And in many places in the world, there's not very good understanding of how many have been harvested and how this jewelry industry works. So I started working with a colleague, a good friend of mine in Mexico, and we started to look around an island called Cozumel at what's happening with the black coral harvesting there. So here's some photos, and so this is on the top right here. This is Erica Gress. She's a Mexican marine conservationist who I worked with on this project, and so here she is using the camera system to measure the corals and count the corals that we're seeing. And so we did, and what's really interesting about working in Mexico is in about 1995 there were some surveys done of black corals in the region. And so we were able to go back a couple of years ago and survey the same places and look at what had happened to the population to see if the population of black corals were still declining, or if they were stable, or if they were recovering. And unfortunately, we found that when we were looking on these deep reefs at the black corals, we found that their numbers had continued to go down. So Erica and some other colleagues of mine, some other friends of mine, have been working a bit with some of the Mexican government organizations responsible for marine protection and managing corals to help improve the protection for them in the region. And we're hopeful that there should be some increased protection for them very, very soon. So I'm just going to move on to kind of the final project I want to talk about. And this is some work I've been doing in the last year or two with WWF. And so most of my work now is very focused around marine protection in Indonesia. And so Indonesia is one of the largest countries in the world. It's in Southeast Asia, and they have some of the most extensive reefs, the most extensive coral reefs of any country. And so WWF has been working in Indonesia to help improve the protection for coral reefs and make fisheries there, because there's a lot of fishing going on coral reefs, to try and make it more sustainable. And when I say sustainable, I mean make it kind of longer lasting, so that the fish populations don't all disappear. And so in Indonesia, I've been working with some partners at Conservation International, and we've been doing some surveys of deep reefs there and looking at how marine protection affects deep reefs. And I don't have too much to say on this at the moment. This is very much a work in progress. So the previous two projects I talked about are kind of things I've done and we've analysed and had results and finished. And this is something that's really very much work in progress. So I hope maybe in a year or two's time I can come back and talk to you and tell you the results of our work on deep reefs in Indonesia. So I'm going to wrap up now and conclude, but I just want to finish by giving a quick plug to some of the work that WWF does with wild classrooms. So if any teachers out there are looking for lesson plans or other classroom materials about wildlife and wild places, please do just check out WWF's Wild Classroom programme. We have a lot of resources there that may interest you. So I'm going to finish there and hand back over to Jesse to take questions.
Outstanding, Dominic. And yes, we will certainly be in touch in a year to hear about deep reefs, because that sounds amazing. So thank you so much for the presentation, and we will dive right in with questions. So Miss Bradbury's group, we'll start with you guys. If you have a question.
Anybody got any questions?
Come on up.
Any questions?
I know you got a question.
Nope. You got some questions?
Yeah.
Yes, we have some questions. Yes, we have some questions.
Come on up. Come to the computer.
Come
on up. How long does it take you to retrieve all this data about the ocean and stuff?
Sorry, could you say that again? The internet broke up a little bit.
Yeah, how long does it take to retrieve all the data? How long are you collecting data for?
So it depends a lot based on the project. So normally to go and to survey, say, on a coral reef, we can get a lot of data in just one day of actually diving there and collecting data. But then actually the biggest challenge isn't so much collecting the data. It's we collect a lot with the video cameras, but then we have to come back and analyze that data. So we have to very, very slowly go through all the video and identify every fish and every coral that we're interested in. So actually that's what takes the most time. So on a typical day, we could collect, do quite a lot of surveys, but what we can collect in one day probably takes us several weeks in front of the computer back in the office to actually analyze and get the data out of it.
Excellent. All right, let's go to Miss Forsyth's class.
Have you ever been bit by a lionfish?
No.
Have I ever been bit by a lionfish? I've never been bitten by a lionfish, although it sounds quite exciting. I kind of wish I had. But unfortunately, no. They're very scared of divers normally, particularly in places where there's conservation work going on, and so the lionfish kind of learn that divers are likely to try and catch them, so they tend to try and avoid divers. I've never been the venomous spines on them, which is where which you don't want to be spined by. I've never been spined by one. I know a few people who have, and their hands, where they got spined in their hands, and their hand swelled up in a huge way, and it was very painful for about a day, and it took about 3 or 4 days for the swelling to go down. So luckily I've never had that, and I don't want to, if I can avoid it. Fingers crossed, indeed.
Oh dear. Awesome. Let's go to Miss Stone's class. If you guys have a question.
That's us.
That's you.
Riley, how do I unmute it? I'm going to make sure.
Good.
Am I good? Okay, Riley. Say it loud.
How many different coral fish are there?
Oh, wow. How many different coral fish are there?
Wow.
That's a really tough question, but a really, really good question. So this is a real big problem that scientists have been struggling with. So the answer is we don't know. So we know of many hundreds of different coral fish species out there. But one of the big challenges is that it's difficult to collect the fish and identify them. But also lots of fish look very similar. But when we start doing very clever analysis where we start to use DNA and genetic testing, we often find that fish that look like they're the same species are actually different species. So the answer is no one knows. And this is actually a really big question that scientists are trying to answer at the moment. But there's definitely many, many hundreds of them out there. Good question.
The most profound questions come from the youngest kids. Let's go to Miss Robertson's class. If you guys have a question, go for it.
Okay. Just go ahead, sir. You can stand up. Stand up.
What's the deepest dive you have done?
The deepest dive I've done? Wow. So the deepest dive I've done is to 100 meters depth, which is pretty deep for diving. And I did some very quick surveys down there looking at these deep reefs. And it was very cool, actually, because I was in Honduras. And in Honduras, in the past, there's been a lot of shark fishing. So we don't see many sharks on the reef. And I didn't think there were any sharks around the island I was diving on. And I did this deep dive to 100 meters, and down on that reef, I found some sharks that we hadn't seen anywhere in the shallows. So I think there's some really cool things and some really cool fish and other animals that are down on the deep reefs that maybe have disappeared in the shallows that we can see when we go deeper.
Very cool. Can I just say, too, that was very humble, but 100 meters is really, really far. Like, most people do not go to 100 meters, so well done. Ms. Dominsky, I'm going to come to you in just 2 seconds. We'll start with Ms. Morrison's class, just because you guys are really quick with demuting. So come on and ask a question, and we'll be next. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
How long can you stay underwater with the deep reefs?
Cool.
So that's another good question. So we often have to plan this very carefully. So the answer is it depends. And so the shorter, one of the things when we do these deep dives is we can go down to the deep reefs, but we have to come up very, very slowly. So we can go down very quickly, but to come up, we have to be really, really slow. So often the question is kind of how long do we want to spend diving? So at 100 meters, we can comfortably spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes down there, and then that will take us probably about 4 hours to come back to the surface. But that's a very, very long amount of time in the water. If we're a little bit shallower, say we're at 85 meters or 70 meters, which is still pretty deep, we can do around 20 minutes down there to collect data, and then it will take us to come back up, because we have to come up very, very slowly. It will take us about 3 or 4 hours to come up from there. So it's not very long. So it's a long time in the water, but not very long actually on the deep reefs.
Cool. Excellent. All right, let's go to Miss Dominski's class. If you guys just demute your mic, you're good to go.
How did the lionfish switch to a different habitat?
That's a really good question, and that's something actually that a lot of scientists are working on as well. So lionfish are very adaptable, and so they're what we call, in the science world, we call them a habitat generalist, which means that they can generally exist in lots of different habitats and survive in lots of habitats. So even where they're found naturally in the Indian and Pacific Ocean, they tend to be found on lots of different habitats. So you find them on the coral reefs in the shallows, you find them on deeper coral reefs, you can find them on seagrass beds, which is a different type of habitat. So seagrass is a plant that lives in the ocean, and also in mangrove forests. The mangroves are a tree that lives kind of on the water's edge into the sea. So they're naturally found in lots of different places. And so I think it's the same in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic Ocean, where they've been introduced. And the reason they can survive in so many different habitats is because they eat lots of different things. So they can survive off eating little shrimp or little crabs, or even eating small fish. So they're very good at eating whatever's around them.
All right, and we'll do a whole other round. Let's start back up again with Miss Bradbury's class.
There you go.
Took you long enough. I have a question. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi to all the classes. My name's Zaria.
Okay, what's your question?
When you've been in the water, when you go in the water, like really deep in the water, then how cold does it get? Like, is it too cold? You can't go some
Is it cold and it makes you?
It's just like can you get like hypothermia if you go too far down?
Yeah. So it does get colder as you go deeper. So definitely, it is colder than in the shallows. But it's not that cold. I've been diving in places that are in the tropics, so it's warm water anyway. So although it gets colder, it's not too cold. What's kind of the bigger thing is that because we're doing such long dives, we're spending maybe 4 hours in the water. So although the water is very warm, after 4 hours in the water, it does start to feel a bit cold. So we'd still have to wear quite thick wetsuits to try and keep ourselves warm for the long dives. But the water temperature, it gets a bit colder, but not too much colder down there.
Excellent. All right, let's go to Miss Forsyth's class.
Any other questions, guys?
What happens if you come up too fast? Do we have questions?
Yeah, that's a good question. What happens if you come up too fast, Dominic?
Oh, bad things. One of the things when we dive, as you go deeper, the pressure around you increases, and so you may have started to talk a little bit about pressure in some of your science classes. When you go deeper, as the pressure increases, more of the gas that you're breathing. So you're not breathing air, but you're breathing a special mixture of gas that absorbs into your body under the pressure. And so when you come up, you want that gas to come out because it's dissolved under the pressure and gone into your body under pressure at depth. You want it to come out very slowly. So if you come up too quickly, it comes out too fast, and you end up with lots of little air bubbles or gas bubbles all over your body, which is very, very painful and could even kill you if you came up really fast. So we want to come up nice and slow from these deep dives.
And on that macabre note, let's I thought the bend was going to come up at some point. Let's do Mrs. Stone's class.
Hey, Bryson. Really loud. Over here.
Are coral endangered and why?
Are coral endangered and why?
Okay, yeah. So, oh, sorry, my computer's just doing something weird. Okay, so yes, depending, some corals are endangered, but coral reefs in general are very, very threatened. So, around the world, almost every coral reef has suffered some kind of decline, both from very local damage, so things like too much fishing going on, or from pollution, from people living nearby, and things like that. But also globally, around the whole world, climate change is having a big impact on coral reefs. So because of climate change, temperatures are getting higher, and those high temperatures cause damage to the corals. And there's a lot more I could talk about on that. But just those high temperatures, the way it works is the corals can't survive through the high temperature, so they end up dying from it. So,
well, that's a sad answer, but a good answer. All right, let's wrap up with our final two. So we got Miss Dominski's class first. You guys want to go right ahead.
Okay.
You're good, actually. I can deem you already.
Oh, good. Okay.
The class left, yeah.
One of the students, Chloe, asked, "Does coral have a bone structure?"
That's a really good question. So it depends what you mean by a bone. Yeah, they do have a structure. It's very different to how people like us have our bone structure. So corals build a skeleton made out of what's called calcium carbonate, which is it's a white stone. It's like chalk, and so they build their skeleton out of that. So they have a skeleton structure. I wouldn't quite call it a bone structure, but it's pretty similar. It does the same sort of function. It holds their body together, and so they live on the surface of the skeleton. Yeah.
Very cool. One thing I always like to note too is if you look at some landscapes where you have limestone cliffs, those are like ancient coral reefs from millions of years ago. So 100-foot tall cliffs used to be a coral reef under the ocean, just, came up over millions of years. It's fascinating stuff. Cool. All right, let's wrap up with Miss Morrison's class. So come on up, guys, and take it away.
Have you ever seen a pygmy seahorse?
Wow, that is a fantastic question. Yes, they're amazing. Have you seen a pygmy seahorse, or have you seen photos of pygmy seahorses?
I've seen a photo, but I haven't seen them in real life.
Yeah, they're very, very cool. They're really hard to see because they're on sea fans, and they're mostly on deeper reefs, but they hide so well on the sea fans. It's really hard to see them, and they're perfectly camouflaged because the sea fans, if you look at the structure of a sea fan, it's very bumpy all along the surface, and the pygmy seahorses are tiny, tiny little seahorses that live on the sea fan, and they have really similar bumps all over their body, and they're the same color as a sea fan. It's really hard to see them, but I've been lucky enough, to see some in Indonesia, and so they're very cool. If you get the chance, you should definitely try and see them, or have a look at some photos or video.
I'm going to say to the classes, do look up pygmy seahorses. I think it's either Blue Planet or Planet Earth has an amazing pygmy seahorse section. And I was just looking this up, as we get this a lot. 10 years old, at 10, you're allowed to start getting into diving. So if you're keen to see pygmy seahorses or other amazing creatures, you can be like Dominic and head down starting at 10 years old. All right, Dominic, so other than Wild Classroom, which I'm going to share with all the classes the moment they're done, as we wrap up, is there any last message you want to share? Anything else you want to talk about the oceans before we go?
I just want to say thank you so much for joining, and I hope you found this useful. And please do think about the oceans. Go out there, go visit the sea if you get the chance. There's so much cool stuff to see on the seashore or around the water. So do if you get the chance, go out and explore.
Very cool. All right, Dominic, at the end of every hangout, what we do is we demute everyone's microphone. So Miss Bradbury's class, Miss Forsyth's class, Miss Stone's class, Miss Dominski, and Miss Morrison, if you could join me in saying a big thank you to Dominic. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Say thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome, guys. We look so forward to having you back soon, Dominic. These classes will have first dibs on any deep sea Indonesian reef hangout later, so we look forward to having that.